Welcome, everyone. I'd like to open up the Board of County Commissioners joint meeting with our sister city of Port St. Lucie. Mr. Mayor, this is the first time, and I think I speak on behalf of all of my board members, that we have met like this in a very long time, many years, as a matter of fact. So I'm looking forward to not only welcoming you to our home, but also at our table, and I hope that we will all come to some conclusions that will benefit all of the citizens we represent. So at this time, I'd like to have our roll call and then turn it over to you, if that's okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, Madam Secretary, could you call the roll for the Board of County Commissioners, please?
Chairman Zadowski.
Here.
I'm here, but no longer the chair.
Commissioner Zadowski.
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Bartz.
Here, ma'am.
Commissioner Townsend.
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Mowry.
Yes, ma'am.
Chairman Hutchinson.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me first go ahead and call this special meeting of the City Council to order on Wednesday, November 29th, 2017 at 2:30 p.m. After 4 gavel strokes, I think. I like your style, Madam Chair. Madam Clerk, will you please call our roll?
Councilwoman Morgan.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilman Carvelli.
Present.
Mayor Orvac.
Yes, ma'am.
Vice Mayor Martin.
Here, ma'am.
Councilwoman Carballo.
Here, ma'am.
Madam Chair, if I could, I just would like to reciprocate your good tidings and your kind words.
Thank you.
And we work together all the time in individual capacities. Our staff certainly work together all the time. But this opportunity to come together formally as bodies is special. We appreciate the invitation. We're glad that we're here. And we look forward to finding a path forward where we can really be one St. Lucie County and one that has infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, parks, waterways that our citizens deserve and can be proud of. And let's see what we can do.
I look forward to the conversation. Thank you again, Mayor.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you to your council. Are we going to start off first with whom's going to start the presentation, or who? Before you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Howard Tipton, St. Lucie County Administrator. At the table with me is Deputy County Administrator Mark Satterley. From the City of Port St. Lucie, City Manager Russ Blackburn. And then we have from Vancor Jones, Steve Vancor, who's a principal on that company, and they are the communications folks that we have used for both our polling as well as our strategies in terms of getting the word out. And all of us will speak at one time to kind of kick off your conversation. And so if I could, I'll start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Vancor. Today's discussion points are about trying to reach a general consensus, knowing that we don't have the polling data back yet, but we want to reach a general consensus on the things that we want to try to talk about going forward. And so we want to have a conversation about the amount, a half cent or a whole cent. We want to talk about the duration. Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? You'll recall from our last initiative, it was a half cent for 20 years. The roles and expectations of the elected officials and all of our staffs in outreaching and messaging. It's a big communication, education challenge that's before us anytime you talk about a new tax. And how can we work together to make sure that we're getting that word out? It was mentioned, and this came from the Port St. Lucie documents, the data-driven community feedback on the proposed projects. We want to make sure that the citizens are feeling that the priorities that we're talking about are the priorities that they would like to see done. We talk a little bit about a budget discussion for education. We probably had about $27,000 or so last year for the education component, and that was $9,000 from each of our entities. So Port St. Lucie contributed $9,000, the City of Fort Pierce was in for $9,000, and the county was in for $9,000. Not enough, and so we need to talk about what kind of a budget do we need to think about. We're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about the proposed infrastructure projects. We've developed our lists separately and together. Last year, they were $1.2 billion over the next 20 years. In the near term, it's, for us, it's still hundreds of millions of dollars. So the need certainly outweighs any potential revenues we might receive. But the focus today is less about specific projects and more about general categories of projects that we can then ask Mr. Vancor poll around. One of the things that we had in the last initiative was a Citizen Oversight Committee. The Citizen Oversight Committee was part of the ballot language, and it provided that you would have a group of citizens who would look not at the projects that were being proposed, but where the dollars were going. And what we were trying to do, if you'll remember from our prior conversations, was trying to avoid the lottery bait and switch. And so we wanted to make sure that the sales tax dollars that are coming in are being allocated to these new projects that are being proposed. And then last, we want to talk a little bit about the time frame moving forward. We do have time. One of the failings of our last initiative was that we got really started in August, right after the primary, because of the fire assessment initiative that was on the ballot then, and we didn't want the two to be confused, and so we left ourselves with about 2.5 months worth of time to really get the word out, and that was a challenge for us. So those are the things that we were going to have as kind of an overview for you, and then certainly look forward to the conversation with you as we talk about, as the mayor said, a path forward. So at this time, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Steve Van Cor, who's going to walk us through kind of an overview of his perspective as somebody who does this all the time around the state, as to kind of what went wrong, what can we do better, and what's the right path forward. So.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you for having me. Steve Van Cor Jones Communications, and polling company Clearview Research. I know many of you heard parts of this presentation when I was able to call in recently, so I'll be relatively brief. Because we do, I have been doing this around the state for about 30 years, and we do these all over the place. We try to analyze after we're done. We did 8 of these last year. 7 of them passed. 1 of them, we know which one didn't quite make it. And so we try to analyze, what did we do right, what did we do wrong. So let me tell you what I thought from my professional experience, what we did right. The first was the county commission put it on unanimously, and that's really important to send a clear signal to the community that this has been vetted and the commission unanimously supports it, because what you find in these types of ballot issues is a much stronger tendency for them to come downward. 1 or 2 people speaking against it tends to pull them downward very, very quickly. You saw what happened recently in Martin County. The second thing I thought your team did very well was we developed the ballot language based, as Howard identified, based on the feedback what the voters told us. They're willing to support a half penny based on these types of projects. You weren't supporting things that they weren't going to be enjoying or felt it was needed in this community. You may have saw recently, last cycle down in Palm Beach, where they had a big fight over whether or not to put the money into a performing arts. And the community was strongly opposed to that. The commission, I think, did the right thing, pulled it out, and then it ended up passing. So you developed what I thought was well-researched, well-done ballot language. We have separately analyzed every one of these things that we were able to pull up over the last 20 years and identified which ballot language tends to win, which ballot language tends to lose, and we try to take that, what we see from the winners, and apply that here, overlay that with the polling, and that helps us identify both the structure of the ballot language, working with your attorney to do that, and which projects the public is most likely to support, put them in there. So I thought you guys did a very good job, we as a team did a good job of developing ballot language. I think by necessity, that will have to change. There's some things that are not relevant this time, public safety being one of those things. The projects were also, I thought, well vetted, a lot of community conversation about the things they would like. When we began the conversation, water projects was not in there. It was clear based on what's happening in the lagoon and other neighborhood flooding issues. That was added in as well, and that was very, very popular among the public. Now, we analyze and help communities build websites all over the state. I will say I thought yours was the best one in the state. Very well done, very easy to look at. And what I liked about it in particular, and I would recommend you doing it again moving forward, is when the public goes to those websites, and whether they get there because you're emailing it to them or they're getting it on their social media, whatever that is, the first thing they want to know is what's going to happen in my neighborhood. If I live in the southeast, if I live on Hutchinson Island, if I live over in Port St. Lucie, if I live in Fort Pierce, I'm going to go to that area and see, are there sidewalk projects in my community? Are there road widening or road repairs in my community? Is there neighborhood flooding where I live? While they like the projects, improving roads, improving flooding, are you going to do it where I live or commute? And I thought your website was well done in that regard, did a good job of identifying those projects. I thought your staff did a good job in communicating. We worked side by side in developing speaking notes, and they were wherever they could be to go there. I also thought, and it began with the commission's unanimous vote. As you recall, there was nobody organized that I knew of. There was one little group in Fort Pierce for a moment there that was organized against it, but there was no organized opposition, which is probably why, even though we didn't have a true campaign supporting it, it got so close to 50. Now we talk about, that's all the things that I think went right and could easily be replicated. Where we fell short, as Howard identified, very little money on public education. You may disagree. It's my belief that you owe it to your constituents to let them know where their money is going to go and to dedicate resources to communicate to them to say, hey, I'm not saying to the public, vote yes or vote no. Of course, you wouldn't put it on and tell them to vote no, but don't advocate. You can't do that. But to say, if you vote yes, these are the projects and these are the things, and sometimes that takes a dedication of resources. We put on there, euphemistically, minimal money for advocacy. Minimal actually was zero. There was no entity formed to support this. We did a similar project up in Bay County. We got the business community came together and spent almost $200,000 in advocacy. In Palm Beach, similar numbers. In Manatee County, it was a stunning number, about $375,000 for public advocacy. We feel strongly that that really helps in the community when business leaders and others who care about the future of this county come together, and we can often help, facilitate that. But we had nothing last time, and that's again, I think that's one of the reasons it fell short. So that really where there was no money for advocacy and limited support from the business and community leaders. So that's where the positives were and the negatives were. I also think the partner governments weren't as fully engaged as they could have been, and maybe even this government wasn't as fully engaged as it could have been to push these things. We were hopeful it would get there without it, and we just slid underneath. So where do we go from here? Here's our recommendations, and I think today's meeting is the first one you're doing it. Agree on a vision, a multi-government vision as to where we are going forward. What is it you want? Half, full, number of years, projects, project lists, and what is the plan moving forward? If it's a unified vision, that's the first step. And also, as Howard identified, you have time. Many times we get called in May of an election year, April of an election year, and you're already running out of daylight to get the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure in place to make these things work. Improved ballot language. Our plan is, and I think the county already approved this, to go forward with a poll to test the projects that you guys develop, see which ones are positive, which ones are negatives. For those of you who weren't at the last conversation, the way we analyze it is we take the ballot language, and then we look at those projects, and the ones that poll above the ballot language, we call those elevators, and those are the ones we like to see in the ballot language itself. The ones that aren't as popular, sometimes it's parks, sometimes it's performing arts, sometimes it's outlier projects. If the public doesn't like those, we recommend taking them out. Sometimes you do take them out, sometimes you don't. That's fair, but it's our recommendation is that gets you the best ballot language possible. Also keeping in there some sort of citizen engagement. The public really likes to know. The statute governs, Florida statute, when you put these on the ballot, governs how the money is going to be spent. Your language that you put on there will govern how the money will be spent. Your oversight, you're elected, you represent the public, will govern how this will be spent. The public likes another layer, a citizens advisory committee or council that will review, hey, is the money actually going to these projects, so you're not doing a bait and switch, and they can always raise the red flag. That has seemed to work well, both in terms of putting it on the ballot and in the long run for the good health of these types of initiatives. I wanted to talk a second also about ballot timing. I don't know if that's still a ripe issue, but it's our strong recommendation to put this on the general election, and I'll tell you why. When we do our polling, and I've probably in the last 2 years have done over a dozen, if not more, of these polls, the types of voters who show up in general elections tend to be more supportive of these things. Those who show up in primaries, for example, in primary elections, very, very few no-party affiliates show up, for obvious reasons, right? Well, they tend to be more supportive of these types of initiatives. What we call surge voters, people who only vote in general elections, tend to show up in November and not in the primaries. They tend to be more supportive of these as well. You could, again, look right next door what happened. I know it was a different ballot language, but Martin barely lost, similar to you. Then they went to a special. The demographics were very different. The conversation was very different. That thing lost 2-1. So our recommendation is not to do a special. By the way, one of the attacks on a special is, as you saw in Martin County, it costs the taxpayers an extra $100,000 to hold that special election. I would argue that's money better spent on educating the public than it is having an election. The other variable out there, and this is something you're going to have to struggle with, and we'll have to get ahead of it, hopefully. T.C. Palm wrote an odd editorial. They criticized the Martin
watching on
Commission
TV.
for putting
Or
on the
fake
ballot 1 cent, and said it's actually 1%, and said you shouldn't do that. And in your packet, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not practicing law here, but is the Florida statute. And it clearly says the language you must use as a matter of Florida law. And so they were being criticized. So one of the elements is somebody, not me, going to T.C. Palm and saying, guys, look, we're required to do this by the statute. This is the language we're required to use. Because anything, and this is important, any negativity about these things tends to pull these things down quicker. And if the public thinks you're being misleading because T.C. Palm editorializes about that, that's a negative that pulls the vote down. When you weren't being duplicitous, you were actually following the statute. So I think that's an important element to consider as well. The other one is 10 years or 20 years. I'm sure your bean counters will want you to put 20 years because that means you have more stability and projected revenue. There'll be more projects you can do. There's always more projects than there is money. Going back to the Romans, I'm sure they had the same thing in their local option sales taxes. There's more projects than money. 10 years, 20 years. The only thing we could test both of those, but the only thing I would advise when we develop the ballot language, and your lawyer will hopefully bless this, is instead of putting the end date, we just write in the number of years. And why does that matter? Every time we focus group this, if we put the date, the voters' eyes go to the date, because letter, word, number, and they go number, and then they focus on the number, not what the ballot language is supposed to do. So that's an issue. You guys have to decide what it is you want, how much money you need to do the infrastructure projects you need, and then figure out 10 or 20 years. Our experience is it doesn't make that much of a difference, and you'll be pleased to know the average local option sales tax in the state of Florida is 22.3 years. Some of them are, obviously, most of them are longer than that. So 10 is very short relative to what other states are doing. So it should be need-based, not necessarily based on what we're saying. So I think that just about covers, yeah, that covers it, just having an agreed vision, developing it from our research based on what the public wants, and then moving forward from there. And I'm
Mr.
welcome
Tipter,
any questions.
Mr. Tipton, Mr. Van Coor, there is some questions from the board members that I'd like to let them have the opportunity to address you on.
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Carvelli?
Thank you, sir. A quick question. I just wrote one note. You mentioned the T.C. Palm editorial. I worked on 2 of these in this county that passed, and my question is, did anyone go to T.C. Palm in advance of putting the information out about the referendum and educate the editorial board on it? Because that's what we did. And that
I do
really
not know
helped.
the answer. I didn't work for Martin County when they did their initiative, so I don't know, but you've done this, so you would know that would be one of the things you would have to sit down with them and go through with them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Additional questions from the council? I'd like to ask a question. How many precincts approved it? Did you evaluate on a precinct-by-precinct basis?
I did. I don't recall the number, but when I get back to my office, I'll pull it up, and if I can email it to Howard and Mark, and they can get that information to you.
I'd appreciate it. I believe that we'll see that Fort Pierce actually did the best job on a precinct-by-precinct basis. I think they had 3 or 4 precincts that approved it. I think in all of the county, was it 2, maybe, that approved it? Just a couple. And then I think 0 in Port St. Lucie. And I think that's a testament to your testimony that we didn't personally campaign for it, certainly at an adequate level. And so I think one of the things that you'll see in the city manager's letter, you probably have already seen it, is that we're here to, I think, based on the council's previous discussions, we're here to join with you in moving forward, but we have to all be in, because the only way that this gets approved, I think in our collective opinion, is if not only we put a little bit of money into education, but more importantly, that we're willing to put our blood, sweat, and tears into boots on the ground and going door to door and talking to all the HOAs and doing everything it takes to win a campaign. And certainly, Madam Chair, you know about winning campaigns, and everyone on the dais does.
Right.
And that's what it's going to take for this issue. So I appreciate your consultant's testimony.
Mayor, can I, for just a moment, editorialize? I do a lot of work with the League of Cities, and I'm a big believer in local government. And what you're saying resonates with me in that we hear a lot of negativity about government, but we see through our polling all the time, people really care what you think. You're local. They see you at Publix. They see you rowing on their neighborhood lakes, or whatever it is, you running in 5Ks or doing what you do. They really value what local government says about these things. And so I just to echo what you've said, I strongly agree with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mowry.
Just a little bit of a comment, though. I know it also becomes a challenge, though, for us as it relates to advocating versus educating. And so there becomes a big struggle with how we actually will be able to go about doing that to make sure we don't cross the line in that area. And that is a struggle, and it's one that we'll work with, but it's one that we definitely have a lot of opportunities for.
Excellent point.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I'd like to just confront that issue right now. So it's my understanding, we have consultant, we have lawyers in the room. It's my understanding that the government itself, the institution, can only educate. It cannot engage in what is commonly referred to as electioneering under statutes and in many, many opinions that you could find with the Attorney General. That's my understanding. But it's also my understanding that in our individual capacity as elected officials, we have a right to have an opinion on anything we choose. So I didn't think individually we could be in violation of advocating a position. I'd like to have that addressed.
Mr. Mayor, we have talked about that. I am not an attorney either, but it is, I believe, our opinion that you can engage in professing your opinions, and you can advocate for something to be passed. We cannot use public dollars to do that, but you can certainly express your opinion. And Dan or any other attorney in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, but you can express your opinion and advocate for it.
You need to be on the mic. We're taping, sorry. I know you want to hide in the back, but.
You would think after 32 years I'd
Really?
get that, but, so I apologize. But yes, Dan McIntyre, County Attorney, I think that's exactly right. That's what the law is. I think from an individual standpoint, you don't check it at the door. You have the right to go out and advocate yes or no. You can attend forums. As long as the government doesn't pay for this and pays for, like an example would be the government paying for a political ad to advocate. That's a no-go. But if you're going to go out to homeowners groups or things like that, a forum, you're absolutely entitled to state your opinion, and that's specifically allowed in the law.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Madam Chair. And in another life, I actually wrote a couple of election guides that passed muster and were successful. It wasn't because of the guide, it was because of the questions. I'll just clarify that for the record. But it's my intention, at least personally, that if we move forward together, that I would take the appropriately funded education materials on a roadshow to as many HOAs as possible, at which I would say, I am asking you to vote yes on whatever this is going to be called. And it's my understanding that that's legitimate, and been advised that that's legal, and that's consistent with the opinions that I've read, like on Pam Bondi's webpage and a million other places.
Well, as you said, I think you've thrown a challenge out there, so.
Throwing down the gauntlet.
There you go.
Mayor.
Madam
Vice
Chair,
Mayor.
So
I'm
I've
sorry, go
already,
ahead.
sorry, I've already stated publicly at our last meeting that I would be willing to do just that, and to speak to it, go to as many HOA meetings in my district, any forums, and advocate for it, especially since one of the major projects that is so desperately needed is in my district, and has been, every time I go somewhere, I get asked about when is PSL Boulevard South going to get done. So definitely in for it.
Which I think is different than last time, Madam Chair.
Mayor.
Ma'am.
I would like to ask a clarifying question on the 10-year proposal versus the 20-year. One could assume that in the 10 years, if we do the one set, it would increase the budget and it would give us the ability to get a lot done within that 10-year span. And so have you polled or have any polling data to show as far as the success, as far as these passing, based upon what you're able to accomplish in what time period?
Well, I'm not an actuary. I'm not the person who spends your money, right? But we have polled half versus 1 and 10 versus 20. And what we find consistently is half is easier to pass than 1, much easier.
Okay.
In fact, when we polled the 1 in St. Lucie, it was our recommendation that it had 0% chance of passing. But the 10 versus 20 seems to make almost no difference at all.
So the time frame is really the amount, not necessarily the time frame that is important to the
Yeah,
citizen.
the time frame doesn't alter the polling, but the amount, the half or the full, does.
Excellent, thank you. And just to also comment on the Vice Mayor and the Mayor's comments, I as well stated at the meeting that I am willing to support and do everything that I can through my office to support this initiative and get the word out.
Thank you.
If we're weighing in on support, I can tell you that I have a large section of my district that has no roads, no drainage, no sidewalks. And all of you here know that I fight vehemently to protect the lagoon. And most recently, many parts of my district also were flooded. So all of which are important issues for my district specifically, and I think that each one of us in any district has similar challenges. Probably not having dirt roads, maybe one other of us up here, but I'm absolutely positively in support and will work hard to try and achieve the revenue necessary to make the improvements and/or in some cases the initial stages of roads and drainage in parts of my community.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any other comments or questions?
Go. You know, I having worked on a couple of these at one on the school board, the key factor was the project list. And, you know, in order to get the Port St. Lucie large block of voters to support countywide projects, I would hope that we could see the project list for the county, what the city of Fort Pierce is proposing. I know we wanted to stay at the 20,000-foot altitude level, but I think when you bring it out to sell it like we did, we went PTOs, Treasure Coast Builders, the Realtor Association, we brought forward the project list and showed the broad diversity throughout the county that where we build our schools, and it passed pretty heavy.
If I could, that's a really good observation.
Yeah,
that in our experience, both with focus groups and polling, the public likes to know they're willing to pay, by and large, these taxes if they know the money's going to solve certain problems. We jokingly say that they're willing to pay more if they get more stuff, and if it's the stuff they like. And we saw that in spades in Palm Beach County.
Councilman Carvelli, one of the things that we really focused on in the last effort was no matter where we went, we always made sure that we focused on the projects, in particular to those areas where we were, whether it was water quality, that was big on the island, sidewalks, or in Fort Pierce roads. When we asked the city of Fort Pierce which roads needed work, they said all of them. So, we really had a pretty robust list of projects, and we really tried to focus it on where we were speaking.
Commissioner Mowry.
And maybe, Mr. Bancor, you may be able to just add to that. Obviously, we'll want to develop those project lists, but absent the ballot language, the project list won't generally be included based upon experience in that ballot language. Some communities actually, as you know, have tried to put a lot of those in. They'll try and name all these different projects and put it into their verbiage limit, and it's oftentimes caused them trouble. But it is important, aside from that, is to make the list, work on those, to prepare and get ready, realizing, though, depending upon how much detail you do, that's also hurt some communities because they put so much time and effort, they create a list, and then some people see, well, my road was left off. I assumed it was going to be a part. So when you try and create certain types of lists, it's then worked against some depending upon how exhaustive a list you've tried to create rather than trying to be at times a little bit more generic.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I would just like to remind also, I know you were in the conference call with us, to point out to the board or the council members of Port St. Lucie that one of the things we had identified as the board was that it said St. Lucie County, and that's what the voters looked at, that we needed to recognize the cities in the language moving forward so that the residents see the city of Port St. Lucie and the city of Fort Pierce so they understand that they're voting on something specifically for themselves and not just in the unincorporated county. I thought that that was a valid point that needed to be brought up so that you understand that needs to be out there so that the residents of the city understand.
And that's a really good point to your advocacy and I mean, in your education, not your advocacy, to explain to the voters because the county language is statutory, right? So in a county like this, people, well, wait a second, because there's a clear differentiation. If I live in the county or I live in a specific municipality, that's where the education comes in to explain to people. This doesn't mean that's a really good point. That's not in your city.
Well, I mean, right, people understand they live in St. Lucie County, but they don't look at it at a quick glance. They just think, I'm in the city of Port St. Lucie, and that's all they think about, is they think about what happens in the city of Port St. Lucie. They don't stop and realize that the county's affected by everything that they do, and we help the city for them to be where they are today. So if they recognize that because they vote and they think so quickly on their feet, if they see the city of Port St. Lucie in there, they're going to identify to that versus just St. Lucie County. So that was important and imperative that that be in the language moving forward.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I don't know that you, and that would be a question for Dan, is can you build into there the municipalities into the ballot language, and does that displace more important things? And that's something we could certainly test and experience. But we'll usually drive the lawyers crazy in doing this. We try to accommodate stuff like that.
Mr. Tipton, would you like to continue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just two more slides, really. This next slide is to just, when we talk about the dollars that could be coming in, and the good news is this has gone up. The distribution for the half and the full cent, we're now talking about, at a half cent, we're talking about $18.5 million. This would be based on starting in 2019. When we did this before, it was $15,500,000, and that's a nice bump. And so that just means there's more under the half cent formula to be shared. When you look at the 1 cent rate, obviously then that's a much higher. So that goes to $37 million coming into the community. You know, as we've talked before, the sales tax is a great vehicle for the types of projects and the types of things that we want to do. And the beauty of it is it allows for the participation of our visitors and our tourists and folks who are just coming into our community to help pay for that freight. And so that's the primary benefit of it. And as we continue to see our tourism grow, as we continue to see visitors coming in grow, this is the opportunity to help grow this number. And so that's the primary benefit. And so as we started, we've had the conversation and listening to you on the amount and the duration. To the north of us, Indian River County, they have done several 10-year referendums and have been successful in that. Up there, they've got a 1 cent. They don't have a half cent for their schools, and so their sales tax rate is at 7%. But they have been successful with that 10-year block of time. I defer to the experts as to how that works and what's the right balance for our community, because every community is a little different. I appreciate, and I think we all appreciate, the conversation from the elected officials on the willingness to be out there and be helping to really drive the conversation. As I've shared with our commission and as Mr. Vancour shared, the voters know you and they don't know us. And if you're out there helping to drive this conversation, that's a big difference than Howard or Russ being out there to have this conversation. So we appreciate your leadership on that. How we want to get some of the data on the projects that are proposed, I think maybe a little unique to each governmental organization as each one presents their projects for consideration. But I do, and I think all of us would agree that having that citizen feedback on those projects makes all the sense in the world. And so we'll continue to work on that. When we talk about the education budget, It's just a number to just kind of put in your head, but my guess would be we need to be somewhere in that $100,000 range for an education budget. There are some things that obviously we can do in-house in terms of our video production and some of the other pieces to that, and each of us has those capabilities. But in terms of mailings, in terms of getting the information out before folks, there's going to be that cost. And so that's just something for us to just think about. We'll refine that number, but that's just a number that we've kind of kicked around internally. As to many of your points, having specific proposed projects is going to be critical to have folks take a look at. To evaluate and to make sure that we're speaking to these new dollars coming in. Here's the new projects that will get done. And so each of the agencies will be bringing forward their projects for your consideration. Again, we've done that this past year. Over a 20-year period, we were looking at a $600 million unfunded backlog. And we've got all of those projects listed as part of our, and in fact, they were on the website. But what the website would do is you'd go to the website, and as you went over the map, it would pull up projects that were going to be in your area. And so it kind of, speaking to Mr. Vancore's point, it gave us an opportunity to kind of show folks what was going to be happening in their backyard. Whether or not you would like us to proceed with kind of a similar fashion with that Citizen Oversight Committee, I think we'd love some feedback from you on that. I think, as Steve said, it adds a level of comfort. It can add a level of, an extra layer as well. And so if there's another way that you would like us to go about that or take a look at it, we're all ears for that.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
As part of the Citizens Oversight, I think each of us has had a Citizens Budget Committee, either in the past or you're reestablishing yours. And we have been very well served by those very adventurous but also very keen individuals. Many have a great deal of education background in finance and otherwise, as well as government. And so I think those are pretty good models that we could utilize in creating that. And in the case of having multiple municipalities in the county, I think it would be something we'd individually, but maybe collectively. I don't know, it may get too unwieldy if we have, two cities in the county as an oversight committee, because those who are in Fort Pierce may not recognize or understand the projects in Port St. Lucie. So those would be largely individual to each entity. But using our budget, citizens budget committees as a roadmap might be something we could all utilize as having been successful.
And Commissioner, to your point, our prior conversations had been that each entity would have their own oversight committee, but that they would get together once a year for representing all of the different entities and share kind of an annual report. Here's the money that was raised, and here are the dollars that were allocated, and there would be that transparency to it. Again, it can be configured any which way you would like. But I think all of us agree that making sure that the dollars are accounted for and going to the projects that have been identified is going to be critical.
Vice Mayor, if I could ask the chair for her prerogative, do you want to allow staff to get through all the bullet points and then hit it from the top down, or do
That's
you
kind
want to
of
just
what I'd like to do, and
Okay.
then let the board ask questions or comment on different things. That's the easiest, I
Okay.
think.
I'll come back to you, Vice Mayor.
Okay.
And then, Madam Chair, the last thing is for the time frame to move forward. We've talked about the performing the polling activity in January, and with the additional detailed information that's been provided by the city, I think we're going to be in a good position to really get the depth that we would like to see in those results, and then we'll be turning around, sharing that information with everybody, and then it's working on the ballot language. Making sure that we're in agreement in terms of what's included and what won't be included, and then putting it before the board of county commissioners for approval, including the ballot language for the November 2018 referendum.
Okay. Before I open up to the board, I did need some clarification. Mr. Vancore, in your expertise, if you will, in working with other counties, what was the time frame for the education?
It varies dramatically, but usually 3 to 4 months before Now, when you say education, going to Kiwanis clubs, going to Rotary clubs, going to local chambers, as long as a year, as short as 60 days. Paid advocacy, meaning communicating directly with the public, building up a website, going on a little bit more of a formal tour, is about 60 to 90 days before the election.
Okay, I'm just going to make a comment because even though there's going to be a lot of conversation, one of the things that you had noted that where we failed, type of thing, was the lack of business buy-in.
Yes, ma'am.
Which I think played huge because there was a lot of questions that I was getting, that they didn't realize that up to a certain limit, the tax didn't apply. When it came to cars or boats or any of those types of things. So I think from an education standpoint, that would be, if we're going to ask for buy-in, we really need to hit a lot of our businesses first and forefront, not to forget about the citizenry. We need them because a lot of our businesses are a mouthpiece. People go to them for a lot of varied reasons. And if you have a store clerk who's going to say, oh, if you vote on that thing, it's on the ballot, it's everything you just bought is going to go up at another penny or half penny. All they're going to hear is going to go up.
Yep.
So I think that I would, as much as we'd like to make sure that the citizens are involved and that they understand it and it's clear, I think we fail ourselves if we don't bring the business community to the table, whether it's to help to do the advocacy and or be a part of the program to get it out
That's exactly.
there.
I mean, you saw in Palm Beach with the Economic Development Group was all in. In Bay County, a similar group was all in with more hotel tourist business. They were huge supportive. Manatee County, it was everybody all the time. It was the perfect model. I mean, like I said, in Manatee County, which isn't that big, they donated $370,000. It was the restaurant groups, the tourist groups, the builders, the road builders, the engineers. Everybody was on board. It was fantastic.
So, I mean, I know one of the things I would like to suggest is that it's going to be incumbent not only upon us as we come to some agreements and it starts getting fine-tuned, but we need to get out now and start talking to the different businesses, the chambers, the realtor, all the ones you mentioned, Chris, the tourist development groups and so forth.
The
realtors, so that they are all aware.
The Builders
I don't want to go
Association.
spending a
TCBA.
lot of funding and a lot of energy from staff, from this board, if I don't know up front there is an interest. That would be my biggest concern as of today. I need some feedback from them now. Not so much at this moment, but before we go down this road, because if there's no buy-in or no willingness to talk, then I think we're going to just repeat history.
Very good point.
I'll give you an amen.
What I'd like to do, Mayor, if it's okay with you, I know this staff has worked very hard and I think they're covering everything, but if the boards want to ask some questions right now, but then I want to make sure that we get very concise as far as direction to our respective boards on at least the things we can touch on today.
If it's
And
okay.
give it, but so I don't know if you're willing to go ahead and ask your board first if they would like to, I'm sorry, your council, if they would like to ask any questions, and then I'll open up to the BOCC.
If it's okay with you, yes, I'd like to ask for clarifying questions in the hope that after clarifying questions are complete, we'll actually take the discussion bullet by bullet for debate,
Right.
deliberation. Is that
Thank you. I
okay?
like that word better.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Council, any clarifying questions on the presentation?
I do have one.
Councilwoman Carballo?
Thank you, Mayor. Looking at some of the backup, I did notice that at one point we talk about tourism, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 25% of the tax dollars are tourist-based. Do we have a full-time and a part-time residency as far as how much impact do our part-time residents have? And the reason why I'm asking that is because my fear is putting out in some of the statistical facts, like tourism pays 25% of the taxes here. Well, to me, as the resident that's lived here and is paying taxes all year round, that doesn't sound like a huge buy-in, because I, the resident, is putting in 75% of that. So being that we do have seasonal people, and I believe still in high numbers, I'm wondering, do we have any data on that to help paint a narrative?
I don't. We usually get that from someone within either the local tourist development council or the county government itself, and then we test that. We've seen those numbers in Bay County. It was 37%, and the reason that's in there, it polls really high because the public wants to know that the people who come here and visit here share in the cost of building our roads or taking care of our flooding, et cetera, versus like a property tax where, you know, except by proxy if I have an Airbnb or a hotel, but by and large, the tourists are helping pay their fair share. Very powerful. The two most powerful messages are every dollar raised stays right here in our community. And that's a little bit of lack of trust of DC relative to the trust they have in local government, A, and B, the idea that people who visit and come here to work temporarily help pay for these roads. Those two issues generally poll very well, but the specific numbers we usually have to get somebody, get from somebody with, you know, more of an actuarial degree than I have.
Excellent, thank you.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Let me go to Councilwoman Morgan. Let her break the ice down there.
Thank you. We had mentioned getting several others on board, such as the Treasure Coast Builders Association, the St. Lucie County Chamber of Commerce, and the Realtors Association. Have they all been, has this all been discussed with them, and are they all on board with this? Do we have their support?
We've had conversations, and of course, last time around, we had support from all of the groups, and so that was positive, and we enjoyed our conversations with them. I believe we have talked to the realtors so far about this, and we anticipate going out to the other parties. But I think the business focus that has been discussed is going to be key for us, getting not only just to those groups, but to a much broader base of business.
The speaking points and the education, and of course I've mentioned this in many meetings that we've had, is to make sure that we are all educated on the speaking points so that it's not 5, 10, there's 15, also the city of Fort Pierce, so that we're speaking on the same points, not, oh, well, I heard that so-and-so said it at this meeting, that's not what it's going to be spent for. We have to be well-educated, and before we go out and speak, make sure we've gone through a speaker's certification, I would say, or whatever you want to call it, to make sure that we're all on the same page. Because there's nothing worse than if I go out to a homeowners association and speak about it, and then Kathy goes to another homeowners and they're going, well, wait a minute, you know, Stephanie didn't say that. She said it was, so we definitely need to be all on the same page.
That's a really good point.
I saw, you know, it's years ago working on a different one, you could not speak on the subject unless you went through the certification of being a speaker and being educated. So that's very important, I think, to make sure we do the same.
It's a great point. I'd like to enter that into the record under roles and expectations of elected officials. Could we just limit this to clarifying questions? Any? Yeah, I can't see you down there. Hey, you. I mean, you're tall.
No,
but I can't clarify
I'll
questions.
save the rest for later. I have several other questions and comments, but I'll save the rest for later. It's really making sure that we had the associations backing us.
Thank you. Dr. Carvelli?
Yeah, that was my question, was have you seen speakers bureaus used where they were trained as a group and they had the same literature, the same message? Have you seen that used successfully in the campaigns you worked with?
Yes, sir.
That was my
done
question.
that, yeah. Now, with the usual caveat, when you're talking to elected officials, they tend to speak from their own mind.
Well, we also had business
Never
folks.
seen that before.
Yeah, we also had business folks and community leaders and heads of Kiwanis that were on that speakers bureau, not just the elected officials.
I
So
love
when
that idea. I mean,
yeah,
the idea that we
used
could
them.
put together a training and have talking points, messages, and our firm even would be happy to do a practice sessions, Q&As, how they deal with coastal questions, how to pivot and bridge, and all that kind of good stuff. Happy to do it, and I think it's a great idea.
And I think that's what Commissioner Hutchinson was saying, was making sure everyone's on board. When we formed speakers bureaus with the bond referendums with the schools, we had community buy-in on that committee, and I saw it used in other communities where they were on the team essentially, and they were helping you sell this referendum. And that's what Commissioner Hutchinson, I kind of picked up on what she was saying was, if we go out solo on this and everybody's standing behind us, the question is, are we being supported by large groups? And that's what's going to win this thing, effectively. I read the numbers here, and I saw some drop-off in some places. And that's why I mentioned the project list.
One of the best examples was Alachua County went at it twice. The first time, simultaneous to when they did it with Leon County, where we had the highest ever for a local option sales tax. Then I guess Lake County came along and beat us, but not that I'm competitive. But Alachua did it, and it became the electeds versus the community, and they lost badly. They resurrected it. They came back, and then it was side by side, the electeds with the leadership in the community, and passed by a complete inversion. It went down like 36, and it passed with 64 the next time. It was a great example of how when locals stand side by side with the leaders in the business and other community, environmental community, et cetera, that these things get this huge uplift.
Clarifying questions, not leading questions.
Got it.
Any more clarifying questions?
I'm done.
I think
Thank
you're
you.
batting 1,000 because I think all of your board members are leaders, Greg.
Touche. Well, there's 10 of us. Thank you for the courtesy, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Board of County Commissioners, are there any questions or for clarification?
No, I think that for me, Madam,
Commissioner Sadowski.
just the backup material and the clarification and the memos from our friends in Port St. Lucie are very well laid out. Those of which we've been presented to today are also well laid out. The staying at the 30,000 foot level is good for today. As we develop and get the polling information, will help us to really laser focus our attempts. We do have time this time where we didn't before. I think that gives us a much better chance of understanding, being able to understand and portray the information and deliver the information much better to our community. So those are my points.
Thank you. Commissioner Mowry?
Just looking for a little bit of a clarification as it relates to this cost when we get into the budget discussion. I know that a lot of communities, it seems as though they are developing their, I want to use the word PAC for a better name. They're having an entity that's sort of leading the charge. We didn't have anybody that was involved, so I didn't know if you've identified somebody, an entity that you think is interested in sort of picking up and spearheading it and then running from a business community standpoint. Otherwise, we are just literally trying to go and have people throw money into a hat, but we don't want to be involved in that because we can't be involved in spending. So I didn't know, for clarification purposes, how do we see this happening, as well as I know you've thrown a number out there, whereas my understanding is that generally it's the business community and others that are pulling together and creating a substantial pool of money along with the partner support of the government. So I just wonder maybe between you and Mr. Van Cor, if you can help clarify experience as well as maybe where this may go.
Sure. My comment, Commissioner Mowry, was directed more on just the educational campaign, not the advocacy campaign. So our ability to get information out to the voters, to our residents, regarding the various projects, regarding specifically what we're trying to include and how it's going to be accomplished. That's the education component of it. The advocacy piece, we've not identified necessarily a group that will take that on. We're going to need that. That was a big hole in last year's initiative, and so we're going to need to have a group or groups come together and help to form that political action committee or whatever the right term for it is, so that the donations can go there and they're accounted for that way. So that's going to be important.
Yeah, and they usually work hand in glove, where the county's doing I keep mixing up the words education advocate. They do the education, and then the private group, which is allowed, and the statute even encourages coordination to say, the county's doing this work, you guys are doing your stuff, and then the private group comes along through a ballot initiative committee. All the money is in, it's completely transparent, and then spent through the normal course of action in that way. Those two travel together, and in my experience, that's the best way it works together. And what's interesting about that is there almost seems to be no correlation between the amount of money spent and the success of those. Well, like I said, Manatee County almost went off the rails in terms of how much money they spent. And
they
got
spent or a
57%.
committee spent?
What's that?
They spent as a government,
No,
or?
the government spent very little. The government
There you
spent
go.
about $50,000. Thank you for asking that. That's good clarification. And the private sector spent, as I said before, over $300,000. They got 57%. And that's a very conservative red county. Palm Beach County, the Economic Development Council spent very little money, like around $100,000, and the government spent, I think, around the same amount, and that got 57%. In Bay County, the government spent about $50,000, and the local group spent about $160,000, and they got 57%. So it almost seems, and this goes to the point, when the local governments are joined, arm in arm, and speaking good things about this, and the business community is there, it almost is irrespective of the amount they spend related to the success. Does that make any, we're in Lake County, they spent very little money, but everybody was arm in arm. I think they got like 72%. So it seems to be the culture of togetherness that seems to do a better job than the actual amount.
Thank you. Any other fellow commissioners? Okay.
I come back in.
Yes, please, Commissioner Kowalski.
You brought up the Economic Development Council. Each of us here participate in funding the Economic Development Council. I could see that as an entity to be the nucleus for that advocacy outside of the government side. But because we do fund them in some level, this is a legal question. Do they cross the line, or is there a challenge in that funding that they are somewhat of an arm of the county, and does that get muddled? Does that get grayed? Because I could see the EDC, because from an economic development standpoint, the chamber, the builders, the realtors, all are participatory in what happens with the county in a profit side and developing their business models and so on and so forth. So my question is, from a clarification legal standpoint, do we muddy the water because we fund the EDC, if the EDC were to be that nucleus, to bring those entities together to form the advocacy side? And if so, is there another way in which we could manage that? This is a legal question, so.
Mr. McIntyre, are you available?
He just kept ducking down. I kept trying to get him to raise his head, but because we do have a funding component to the EDC, I just.
And I'll resist the urge to turn this over to the city attorney. The question is an interesting one. Again, the law is pretty clear that you can't spend public dollars on advocacy, whether that's for or against. I want to look at that a little closer. I mean, you're asking the question, it's a legitimate question. My initial reaction is, and it's one that I want to test, is that you're funding these historically. This isn't something that it's a special funding. I think that would be inappropriate. In other words, I was just sort of asked a question a few minutes ago. You can't set up a group and fund it for advocacy. That's clearly inappropriate, I think, anyway. This is a little different, where you've got an economic development group that you've funded for years, at least the county has funded, but it's only a small percentage of their funding. In other words, we're not funding their whole operations or anything like that. But it is, if we could find another group that we wouldn't fund, I think it would be better, because I don't think you want to get into a controversy about public advocacy and use of funds. You're going to lose that even if technically, legally, you're right, you're going to lose it. I think in the public opinion polls. So I would suggest that we find another entity, and maybe a special group that's not part of the EDC, that's set up just for this, and no county dollars or city dollars is involved in that. That would be the better approach, I think. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, may I add, Commissioner, when I referenced the EDC, what I meant by that was, whether it's the EDC or the chamber, in most communities, even the largest communities and the smallest communities, it's the same players. It's the same community leaders that are visionary, care about the community, and are willing to step outside their business to give back to the community. And it tends to be those EDC or chamber members. But all money spent for advocacy must go through a statutorily defined, I think it's called a ballot initiative committee or a political committee, that if any dollars to say vote yes on amendment this year, it might be 32 for all we know, that vote yes on Amendment 16 must be raised and spent through that entity itself and cannot go through those other entities. That's Florida statute that governs that. So I misspoke when I said the EDC. I meant because in Palm Beach County, it happened to be the same exact people sitting in the same room, but they were operating as independent people.
Okay, that's the clarification we were looking for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I was going to move back and let the mayor address it. At this point, Mayor, I think we've got some clarification going here, and I think a lot of the questions that were asked were not only good, but unfortunately, till we start moving down this path, the answers will start fleshing out. So to get down to into the weeds, as was said earlier, the nitty-gritty as far as who's it going to be, and I think today's meeting is more keeping it at the 30,000 until we have some defined definitions, such as polls. So we need to kind of give direction if this is what we're going to go in, the direction we're going to go in, and it's also one of those. And I will again go back to. Then it becomes the part where there's some representatives from the outside business community here today to have a conversation with them and see if there's any buy-in before we go too far down the road. So what I'm hoping for us to accomplish is, and I think I've heard a consensus, and I'm very proud of that, especially on our very first time back at the table again, about, there is at least a willingness on everyone at this table that would be willing to move forward and enlighten ourselves along with the public, along with moving forward the next step of standing hand in hand to ask the residents, would they be willing to move forward with the sales tax? So that, I think that question's been answered. So if maybe we can move to the next one, which would be from a budgetary standpoint, I don't think we need a dollar amount today. But is there, and correct me if I'm wrong, if there's a willingness to partner, and I don't even know what the magic number is. I know you threw out a number, but I'm not going to hold us to that at this point because it still needs to be refined a little bit more.
Madam Chair, as looking at the discussion points, I am not clear on the amount and duration. So I'd really like to have that
discussion first. That's perfectly fine.
Or
Let's
whatever
kinda go
order
through.
that, I
No,
figured
that's
that
fine.
staff put some thought into the order of it, but if not, whatever would,
Okay.
as the host, whatever you see fit, but to go down line by line and make sure that we can develop a formal consensus and position that we know a majority of our respective membership would like to go forward in that direction.
Okay. Mr. Tipton, may I ask you and Mr. Blackburn to kind of mediate this part out on all of this instead of me?
What point would you like us to take first?
Well, I think that's fine. We actually did give some thought to how the conversation could flow.
He's
And-
Mr. Plan into Action. He's Pinto A.
There you go. And what I'd like to do, though, as far as if I could ask if you all can lead the discussion and let us respond back, Mayor, if that's okay, as far as options. You said the conference, because there's several things, components to this one. It's the time frame and it's the amount. And I think one's going to rely on the other. So do you want to start as far as what it is direction you're asking for?
Well, Mr. Van Coor framed it. And we hadn't heard that as a council before, that, not that I'm aware of, that basically 10 years, well, he didn't care about the years, but that 1 cent was DOA, and the half cent polled well, the 1 cent was 0%, and hey, you guys choose if you want 10 or 20. That's what I heard.
And that was from 2016.
That was straight from the
That
old
was
poll.
16.
I'm happy to retest it. I'm not sure it's going to make that much of a difference, but yeah.
Okay.
Okay, would you care to ask your counsel?
Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
Okay. Let me go in order here. Are you wanting to ask your counsel for their discussion first and let us come in afterwards? Or I don't want to do the ping pong ball.
I'd like to
Back
defer
and
to
forth.
you because we're all aware that
Okay.
Commissioner Townsend
Then
has
let's go down the
advocated
road.
a position.
okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Commissioner Bartz.
Madam Chair, the conversation on the surtax amount and the duration, and I've heard a lot, but it has been my understanding is that there is going to be polling done, and we should be getting that information back. And I think to make a decision on that today, without hearing what the people want and can live with and feel good about, we can come up with whatever, and that's supposed to be done fairly soon, correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Commissioner, to your point, one of the things that we would like to just take off the table as a possibility would be a 5-year initiative. It's not enough time, in our opinion, to get that done. I mean, you do see some that are short and very project specific. I think we may have had one in our past to help build the jail, and it was a 1 or 2 year kind of an initiative. But generally speaking, when you're talking about road projects and infrastructure projects, there's a period of time that you need to get that developed and finished. So I think if from our perspective, the direction is we're either looking at 10 or 20 years as a time frame, but nothing shorter than 10. Is that correct?
So I think, Madam Chair, to Commissioner Bartz's point, that echoes what I heard from the council at our special meeting on this topic. The council is very much interested in engaging. If we have a reasonable expectation of winning and reflecting the public desire, we want to be data driven. So it really begs the question, as you pointed out, when will the polling on that issue or any other questions be done?
We'll have that information and the ability to report back to you certainly by the end of January, maybe by the middle of January.
So let's just say end, so we're dealing with worst case scenarios, and I'm sure, because the county commissioners tell me all the time, you over deliver. So you'll have it done maybe before. Mr. Chair, do you want to identify the questions that maybe our respective bodies are identify as being important for polling?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that's the expert sits right there in front of us,
What
is
we would
on
look
it.
for, what are the projects you want tested? What are the project types, whether it's, I'm just going to throw off, is it road improvements? Is it traffic reduction? Is it neighborhood flooding? Is it cleaning up of local waterways? Is it reducing pollution in the drinking water? Is it parks? Is it active parks, passive parks? What are those projects in your wish list? And then we test those to see which ones the public thinks is appropriate for a half penny or a penny tax.
Mayor.
Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Is that
Go right
okay?
ahead.
I'm sorry. I
Yes.
just wanted to add one more thing to the clarifying surtax rate. And the reason why is because I did ask for that initial question to clarify as far as the polling data and the 10 versus 20. But I would also like some other data included, and that is how many passed that were half cent and full cent as far as that were actually put out there. Because the reality is nobody likes to pay more taxes. So if you ask the public, do you want to pay $10 or $20 in taxes? The public is always going to choose to pay the least amount. So to poll that to the public, it's almost like it's always set up to always go to the lesser amount. So the question that I really have is the ones that have actually gone for the 1 cent and that have gone for the half cent, how many have actually passed based upon like the project list and based upon the success rate? And I think that would maybe give us a better picture of that.
Yes, it will, except you have to put some of those in context in that school taxes in many communities generally will pass almost no matter what. And there were Commissioner Carvelli and I were talking about what happened in Manatee County where it was the opposite.
Right.
And sometimes the polling tells you interesting things. Let me give you one example. When we were hired in Manatee County, the natural belief was a half plus a half equals 1, right? When we put the 1 penny on, it started below 50%, which is the death. But when we put 2 halves and asked the public, would you support a half for this and a half for this, it polled at 58%.
Interesting.
I don't understand it, but what happened was, and Commissioner Carvelli, you could speak to this, there was a lot of distrust of the school board, and they wanted to make sure that money was compartmentalized, and then when we limited it to a half of the schools, they said yes overwhelmingly, and separately a half of the roads. So it doesn't always work that way, but yeah, if you ask them, would you pay more or less? And the question for us is, what gets you well above 50? And if something starts in the 40s, it doesn't matter, right? Because if it starts in the 40s, there's almost no way they're going to pass. And the reason is, on these types of ballot issues, and we've looked at dozens upon dozens of them, there's a downward trajectory. It's not like candidates, where candidate A versus candidate B, the undecided split, they tend to go in the no direction. So what you're trying to do is build your ballot language to get it into the mid-50s to start. So if we start at a full penny, and we'll test that, if it starts in the 40s like it did last time, I'm looking at this here, it started at 42. The fool's errand. Don't go for that, because there's no way that's going to pass. 56% started at no. So it's, that's why we the joke is we play the game on Sundays, we test it to see what they'll go with.
And so with the full penny, when we do test that, it would be nice to see too if you could target it the same way like the half cent, where you have a clarifying question, that if we can do if the projects are completed quicker, or we're able to get more things done within a shorter time fashion, would they then be more willing to vote for the penny? And the reason why I'm saying this, because as our conversation progressed on our special city council meeting, I want to earn back the public trust and continue to do that as a city, and I'm sure all of us do. We want to earn that trust. And the faster we can get some of this stuff done, in my opinion, the more they're going to see, they're taking our money and they're putting it to work. So the more money we have to do that, the faster we can prove that. That's kind of my direction of where I'm
So let me
thinking.
make sure I understand what you're thinking, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Would you rather have a full penny for only 10 years or a half for 20 years?
Correct.
Okay. Let me see if I can do that, because what happens is we have limited opportunities to ask the ballot question on a poll, because while we randomize those questions, for each individual person taking the poll, there's an ordering effect. Okay, so the first time I ask it, you're like, yes. Yeah, whatever. But then I ask Commissioner Mowry in a different order. But for him, there's still a different ordering effect. So let me figure out a way to do that and see if I can get that. But I think we'll be able to come back to you. I feel very confident, come back to you and say a full versus a half, 10 versus 20. These are your more likely chances of success.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So before I would go to any of the council members, I just want to summarize what we've already done, Madam Chair, and that is we would like polling on the half versus the 1, the 10 versus 20, and then also the specific project list that we provided. And then I think kind of the flip of that is to identify if there's any other pressing needs that we didn't anticipate. So if there's a way to identify what the number one, what are you willing to invest in, to be able to identify that, so that we think we have a good finger on the pulse of the community, if you will, but sometimes we're surprised, and so it would be good to know if we missed anything. Going to Councilwoman Carballo's point, that's really the sensitivity. Is there sensitivity in the public to urgency? Do they have greater trust? Is it more discreet? Do they feel better about getting something done in a 10-year period, which we can all wrap our heads around, versus a 20-year period? A 20-year period, you get married, you have kids, your kids go to college and almost graduate. 20 years is a long time. So is there any sensitivity to that? So that's what we've previously identified. Council, what else would you, as a body, do we want to have polled? Vice Mayor?
Going back to our special meeting, and we talked about the specific polling to ask our residents the specific questions about the projects that are on the list, because we felt that if they had those specific projects identified, if we identified them, they would be able to, think about it and say, oh yeah, I really do want this, I would really like this road to get done, which I've been waiting for 15 years and hasn't been able to get done for various reasons.
Well,
whether it be PSL Boulevard South, Loresta is a huge one.
I don't think he'd be polling that.
Right.
But-
And we are going to pull that. And to Commissioner Mary, you brought the point up earlier that we're not going to put on the ballot fixing Third and Elm, or
I'm not talking
widening
about
this
the
or that
ballot.
road, but we're saying
I'm not talking about the ballot. I'm talking about when you call people on the phone
Right,
and
right.
you ask them the question. Not
we're
the
not going to
ballot
ask
one.
them, but we're not going to ask them
Well, then-
specifically, do you want Third and Elm widened? Because we know what they're going to say. If they live near Third and Elm, they're going to say yeah. If they don't live near Third and Elm, they're going to say no.
So now now we've identified an issue where we really need to work through, Madam Chair, and we
Yep.
understand that you're paying for Mr. Van Coor, so if it's a matter of budgeting and budgetary fairness, we can have a conversation about that, but we feel very strongly, and I can tell you I feel very strongly based on some pre-polling that I've done and out in the community, is that our residents and business leaders want specific projects. They actually take repaving even sidewalks, which is a huge hot button issue for us.
Sidewalks next to schools. is huge.
Stormwater, they just expect us to do that, though. I have not seen a willingness for them to come out of pocket for an additional tax. They say, hey, government, we already pay you. You're supposed to do it. Get it done. What they're looking for is that next level of service. So we feel very strongly, and we've had some success with a special election before, Crosstown Parkway, 89% approval. So we've had a successful election in Port St. Lucie before, but what we found is that there is not one unifying project like a Crosstown for this election, which would galvanize the entire community, and that we believe, based on what we've seen, subject to being educated by the polling, is that we will have to have projects that move the needle in each geographic area of the city to garner the necessary support to win an election. That's our take on it.
Mr. Mayor.
I agree with you. And let me approach it there's three ways we look at this. One is what's going to be on the ballot language. We're limited to 75 total words, right? So you want to aggregate what those types of projects are: road widening, road improvement, reducing flooding, et cetera. Then you have what we're going to put on the poll, right? So I have a little more latitude in the poll, but even in the poll, I can't ask otherwise the poll will be an hour long and we'll lose them. I'm not going to ask them specific. Think of all the water management projects alone that could be put into this project. A west side holding pond, an improved drainage ditch, resurfacing of such and such. So we broaden it, but on the communications where you guys will build a website and handouts and materials, that's when you'll have the entire list of all the projects, all the widening, all the traffic circles, all the flooding mitigation projects. So if you look at it in three ways, what I'm going to try to do with the poll is be somewhere between the ballot language and the actual project list. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, but Commissioner Zadowski on my left has dinged in with what I think is the proper response, and that is then I would suggest to our council and our staff that we need a different poll, because guess what? The ballot is one thing. What sells the election is us and business leaders going door to door talking about what you get, the value. So you're going to invest this, and in return, you're going to get this. And if this is not significant enough, it fails. And they don't rely on the ballot to tell them that. They rely on us and the Speaker's Bureau and the leaders. So unless we have a list of projects that is, forgive me, sexy enough to move the needle and win approval, there's no point in moving forward. So we want to be data-driven on the projects. Could I go to Mr. Blackburn?
Yes, go right ahead.
Mr. Blackburn?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor and Chair, two suggestions. One is the city will be doing a citizen survey probably around the end of January, early February.
No, you have to beat Howard.
I can wait. So we can include in our citizen survey some very specific projects, and that will be one way for the city to get impact on those projects, and feedback. But I'd also ask Mr. Vandecore, whether we can identify at least some of our major projects for the city in this poll that will be done by the county, so that we get feedback on those projects. For example, Floresta is a big project. City, goes in the city, goes through the county. Our council has identified that as a high priority. Port St. Lucie Boulevard, two of our major projects that we're looking at. And so I recognize that you can't do every project that might be listed, because there will be a lot of them, but
the major ones, absolutely.
Like to try to hit the major ones in this survey and poll. But certainly we can be more specific in our citizen survey that we'll be doing, in January, early February. Secondly, and this is a question from Mr. Vandecore, can we identify Port St. Lucie voters in this poll?
You're going right where I was going, because yes, you can. Because here's what would happen. Let's just take the two major, Fort Pierce, Port St. Lucie. If we say, would you be interested in paying a half-penny sales tax to improve Road X in Port St. Lucie? The people who live in Port St. Lucie are going to be much more likely to say yes than those in Fort Pierce. And inversely, if you say in Fort Pierce, now what happens if you look at the poll, you go, only 34% like this project and only 34% like that project. But what we will do is we're going to look at the voters where they are, and that will give you, so when you're at a Kiwanis Club in Port St. Lucie, you can identify, hey, we're going to do this project. And when you're up in Fort Pierce, you can say, hey, we're going to do this project. And so the public, you get the identification of the public. But what we have to do is having a unified approach to what's the ballot language. My job is to give you the best ballot language possible, so that when the public sees it, they see something in it for themselves. And they say, oh, I like this. And whether that's road widening, road improvement, reduction of flooding, pollution reduction, whatever those things are, new parks in our communities, they end up liking it. Does that make some sense? Because
maybe I can help.
Especially in a county like St. Lucie County, you're not going to get a unified field theory for a road.
I'm going to try to help out here, Mayor, and I understand where some of your councilmen, because I've read the notes from your meeting, and it was very insightful and very well discussed, if you will. So I congratulate you on that. But I think at this stage, I'm recognizing what it is that you're asking for, but to me, this is still the early stages. And if we're going to go down the role of getting back again in the weeds or down in the middle of it, but it's kind of like when my kids were younger, I would ask them, make up your Christmas list and put everything you want on it. And they did. They spent hours doing it. Then when they gave it to me, I turned around and handed it right back to them. I said, now pick your top 3. If you can only get 3 things, number them. Well, then those hours became longer as they thought about them. The next question was, when they handed it back, was, you're only getting 1 gift. Which one do you want? Now, that's kind of how I look at this as being, because you'll see it changing as we go through. But I think what you're asking for is issue related. Is it water related, clean up the lagoon, do the stormwater, flooding, or is it going to be the sexy thing that I know is not so sexy is roads, or is it going to be the parks? You had mentioned those parks in your the backup that I had read. That I think is what you're going to be polling for originally, or at this point, to see what is that trigger. And it's going to be a broad-based one, and then it's again goes back to us to start narrowing it down in the further discussions.
And putting specifics on them, yes, ma'am.
Right. Commissioner Mowry.
Just a couple things, and I know this wasn't necessarily one of our ballot items, but I think the mayor's been hitting on it well, and it's the question really of the ballot language. And I think we have to look at the ballot language. Are we in agreement that we can live with the ballot language, and there's some general tweaks, such as adding the names of Port St. Lucie or Fort Pierce to the ballot language? That's really what staff are going to be looking at, and then the polling is able to take place. Each individual city is going to have to sell their projects, the county as well. We're all going to have to sell our individual projects and work very diligently on that. And as it relates to the polling, I think you need to be clear as well, Mr. Vancor. Your polling is not a large poll as it relates to the number of participants that'll be taking place.
Yeah,
you're looking at a sample size of 500 or 750.
Well, we'll do 400 because that'll give us a very nice
so 400
margin
people
of
in
error.
the sample
So
size. So
yeah, to your point,
400 people.
Spoken with experience, I know, Commissioner Mowry, that when you start narrowing it down, if Fort Pierce is 32% of the population, that means I'll be looking at Fort Pierce, only 130-something participants. Your margin of error starts to grow, so you want to be a little cautious in that. But we will be able to break it down and get some good read on that stuff and see if there's a difference. But that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mayor, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
On the polling, that was my question. Will you look at the percentage of voters in the county in Port St. Lucie versus Fort Pierce versus the unincorporated when you do the polling, and do those numbers proportionally so you don't get skewed in one direction or another? Because that would be my concern. That would be my biggest concern with the polling. If you just did a random poll and you went to the elections office and did a random poll, would you pull percentages of voters because there's a large block in Ports?
That's my biggest concern too in any poll we
That's
do. And I'll
very-
tell you what we do. We balance every poll we do. When I come back to you in January and say this is our poll, that sample, it will look like the electorate of a 2018 general election to the maximum extent practicable. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to balance it by gender. We're going to balance it by race/ethnicity. We're going to balance it by political party, predicting what we think the political party turnout will be, by age, and by geography, and we'll make
Geographical
sure a
location, okay.
minimum of 20% of the calls are taken on cell phones.
Got it.
So that your sample looks like it, so that when so it looks like the electorate from the aggregate, and then we'll be able to apply the margin of error and be able to look at subgroups. So you'll be able to say, well, what about my district? What about my district? What about my city? What about my city? Or what about those who don't live in the incorporated? We'll be able to break those out for you.
Can I do
excellent.
my follow-up question, Mayor? While
Sure.
Okay. My other question is this. There's currently a half-cent sales tax that the schools have in place. And Mr. Tipton, when does that expire?
No, I'm good.
Is that a 10-year?
2026.
Is that a 10 or 20?
I'm looking at it.
Okay.
Yeah, it
So
was
my-
just, it was just reauthorized
Yeah,
not too long
I knew it.
ago.
And,
Yeah.
Sir, Mr. Vancourt, so what's your experience here in Florida when they're at 6.5, stacking 1 cent on top of that? Have it been successful around the state?
I'll give you a short answer, which you won't believe. It has no impact.
No impact? That's all?
The
I
voters
appreciate
look at it as it stands. Is this, I'm willing to
Got
pay
it.
this if I get the stuff that I want.
I appreciate the answer, sir.
I think I have Councilwoman Carballa next.
Mayor, thank you. So going back to the specific question, and I wanted to touch on some of my thoughts on that, and I'm going to support the mayor on this. If you would ask the public whether they're going to vote for something such as this, if they had specifics, would they be more likely to agree or disagree that they would vote on it based on specifics? And anybody, I mean, I don't even need you to poll that. I know.
That's the question.
Obviously, they're going to vote based upon whether they have specifics. Now we have
No, they're going to vote whether they like the specifics.
specifics,
or not.
correct.
Yeah.
Now here's the issue. The issue is that with information overload, so, and I mean, I do marketing. So when you're looking at marketing, something's scrolling through Facebook, such as this sponsorship ad that you might do to promote it. You're going to have very limited data that you can put on here to get someone to pique their interest. So I do believe we need a second poll because we have to find out. Let's say Port St. Lucie picks their top 3 projects. County picks their top 3. Fort Pierce picks their top 3. We pull that data. We need to have that because if the broader public says, let's say it's Main Street in Fort Pierce because the downtown area. I'm giving an example. It's not even close to that, but let's say that's what piques the interest. That has tourism. People want to see it develop further. If that's what piques the broader interest, then that's what we need to hit on in those short pieces. And then I agree, we have the longer list, the more broader list, so when we meet with our HOAs. But then that becomes information overload. So when I'm trying to give information out to the public, I hand them a list of 40 projects that the city can do for them, and they're just looking at the first top 2 anyways.
Exactly. Or the one that's closest to them.
Or the
You're
one that's
exactly
closest
right.
to them. And
Exactly
so
right.
Crosstown, as the mayor stated, was passed, and it passed by overwhelming support because we were very specific and it affected the entire city. The entire city said, we want this.
Right.
I believe we can find.
It was a big project that affected everybody within that municipality, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And I believe we can find, if we put our heads together and we get the right data, we can probably find 3 projects within the entire county that everybody in the county can get on board. And then I believe that will make it more successful. It might be one in Port St. Lucie. It might be one in Fort Pierce. Who knows? That's just my thoughts. Thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to, and I'll keep it short because I know we probably need to move on to other things, but going back to the specifics. If you're calling a real world polling and you're calling somebody in Port St. Lucie and you generalize it and just say projects in St. Lucie County, they're most likely going to say no because they want to know what, and we talked about this on our council, they want to know what they're going to get. So if you're going to call me and I'm in Port St. Lucie and you say, you know, would you be in favor of paying half a cent for 20 years or whatever it is for Floresta? That's a whole different ballgame, and you're going to get different results. But if you generalize the county in the city, you're not going to get the answer that we're looking for. Because
that's not been my experience. My experience is if you talk to people and you ask them what they're interested in, and that's why we pass these all the time, and we describe the types of projects, and then the education and advocacy says this will be in your community, you then get the uplift you desire.
So, Vice Mayor and Council, one, I want to thank Councilwoman Morgan for being on the spot there with the school sales tax data. Thank you, ma'am. You know, I'm comfortable with what everyone said because I think Commissioner Mowry will work on the ballot language, and that's going to come together. I'm not overly concerned about that. Once we get the sensitivity from Mr. Vancourt about the half cent versus 1 cent, 10 versus 20, but I think that Mr. Blackburn offered the key to moving forward, and we just need to make sure that the citizen survey is scientifically significant. I mean, that it's well done. It's rigorous. You know, it meets the standards that it should. We got to cover that, and then we can have a separate conversation, maybe at that December workshop, about clarifying what should be on the survey. It's a real opportunity for us to engage with the citizens, and I think it'll give us, I bet that it'll give us what we need to make us feel comfortable moving forward. And it doesn't impact the ballot language. The ballot language is going to be general enough.
And to your point, Mayor, like for me, I don't want to just, I do want to talk about Port St. Lucie and specify Port St. Lucie, but I want to be able to get on board with other projects too as a whole, as a county, and be able to say, I'm a resident of the county and the county is doing X, and this is part of what's going to help fund that. And so that's a true collaboration, and that's why that specific language I think is super important.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Commissioner Zadowski.
Yeah, just to follow up, the citizen survey sounds like a reasonable attempt to clarify for each of the municipalities and the county specific. And in that citizen survey, can it be left as an open-ended question? What would you support in half-cent sales tax? You know, Mrs. Smith says, "Oh, I would like to see Avenue D repaved," or "I would like to see a new 85-foot bridge going over to North Beach." Whatever is an open-ended, and then kind of, you know, take that collective bit of information, whatever that might be, just as giving them some power back to say, you're asking me questions, let me tell you what I think. Even if it's one or two road projects or sidewalks or parks or some canal issue, I don't know what or how, but give power back to the people who are answering the questions and say, you're asking me questions, now let me tell you what I want.
Right. Commissioner Mowry.
I feel like I just want to make sure we're clear for staff as well as for Mr. Van Coor, because I feel like walking out of here, there have been some great things that we've discussed and talked about. However, it seems like from your perspective, you're going to be polling the ballot language to look to see whether or not the language that we have works. And we talk about individual words. Do they like this word versus that word? I don't.
Yes, sir. My objective is to come back to you based on, take the projects, try to amalgamate them, and then come back to you and say, because remember, at the end of the day, Commissioner Carball, I think you hit the nail on the head in marketing. People are just with information, 20 to 30,000 advertising messages a day. Our job is to, when they go into the voting booth and it's all quiet and they got the pen in their hand, that they got the best ballot language before them that increases the likelihood that they'll say, yeah, I like that. So, Commissioner Mowry, my objective would be to come back to you and say, here's, based on our years of experience and our studies, this is the best ballot language that gives us the best chance of success so that you can fund the projects that your counties and city managers are saying to you, this is what we need to do to move our community forward.
But I want to be clear, because the ballot language that's in place today, I can't imagine it really changing much. We're at 75 words exactly today as it reads. So if we were to add something, when I say add something, for example, Palm Beach County, I watched what happened there. They removed, there was a big issue about, it wasn't...
Cultural arts.
Performing Arts Center.
Cultural arts.
Yeah, and so that obviously torpedoed things, and so it became catastrophic for them. So they realized through polling to pull the one out and to go through that. But everything else was basic. I mean, it was
and parks.
infrastructure.
Remember, we took out parks, too.
Right. So I think, you know, realistically, we can generally talk about projects, but I think it's beholden for each of the cities as well as the county to really look at that language, see if there's something they really feel is inherently missing that should be added, and then to give that to you so that they can allow you to begin to look and poll at that. Otherwise, if people would say, what happened last time, I don't know that it perhaps was the ballot language, unless we're assuming it was more of an education component, and that we didn't do enough to perhaps educate, as well as maybe we didn't have perhaps the buy-in from the city of Port St. Lucie at the time due to efforts that we had. And as a result, now that we have that partnership, we're assuming that that's going to work well. And then everybody does have that individual responsibility to move it forward. But I want to make sure we're clear walking out that staff knows what are we expecting you to do on the ballot language? Are we expecting you to redo the entire ballot language? Or are we expecting you to just take what's there and perhaps tweak some things? Right. Because I don't know if it's been clarified.
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Chair, Mr. Mayor, a couple of things. One, I'm going to need to excuse Mr. Van Coor. He's got to get back down to Fort Lauderdale, and we've kept him actually a little bit longer than he had originally allowed for. And so I want to thank him for being here
Well, thank
this
you for having me
afternoon,
very
and
Thank you.
we appreciate the conversation. As he's walking out, Mr. Blackburn and I have been discussing kind of what the next steps are. And for us, I think if you will allow staff to continue to work with Mr. Vancore on these polling questions to make sure we get as much information as we can through his efforts, couple that with the citizen survey that the city will do and that all of the different agencies may engage in, because I think it's a great way to help validate what we're talking about. And then if we could, so that would be one piece. So staff working on those polling pieces, we'll get that information back to you from Mr. Vancore before the end of January. And then second thing is, because it's been discussed, we need to start the conversations with the business community as we're moving forward. And so we would suggest that members of staff, but with however you want to divvy up the responsibilities, we'd be going out and meeting with the realtors and the Treasure Coast Builders Association and the Chamber and start those conversations about their leadership and involvement in this initiative, and have that as a report back to by the end of January, so that we can have those, we can begin to consolidate kind of the focus of our energies and how we plan to marshal the resources. So we would have two deliverables for you by the end of January. And then we would be looking at your citizen survey coming back and perhaps other information coming back then in February. And then we're able to get back together and have a follow-up conversation whenever that right time is. I know you've got your workshop, I think it was in March, that you were looking at, and we can have it before then or after then, or whatever the time frame is. But I think what we heard from Mr. Vancore is we certainly want to be positioned. We want everything nailed down 6 months out from the election, so that we've got our education component going on, and then the advocacy, which complements everything that the education movement is doing. That's 60 to 90 days coming before the election. So,
Thank you, Mr. Tipton. The mayor and I just had a little sidebar, and I appreciate the fact that the offer from the staff is to continue working together, and I think that would behoove all of us. But what I'd like to ask is, on the very end of your discussion points, is the time frame, and you just gently touched on it. But I think the time frame needs to be acknowledged by all of us as the elected officials. You said January, the end of January, beginning of February. What I'd like Mayor to ask is if they can come to our respective boards, including Fort Pierce, and give those updates and those findings, whatever they may be.
Great. Yeah.
But I also would think, because of a time frame, at some point, both cities and the county, the three, need to sit down, whether it's 6 months from now, 5 months, whatever that time is, where we can start getting into the exactual, here's where we are. Is it the educational? Here's where the staff bringing to us, here's a budget that's been kind of worked down. Here's some feedback from the community that we've heard or that we've engaged in, whether it's the surveys, the business community, so that we know, A, are we moving forward? Do we stand a chance? And then I think we can take the next step. So I would like to offer that invitation to the city, and I hope to follow it up with the city of Fort Pierce, the same invitation. And I'm looking at maybe, 5 to 6 months to try to group this back together again. In the meantime, we'll be sharing information as it comes in, so we're all kept abreast.
Madam Chair, I'd like to accept and to thank you for the offer. I think it's on, and furtherance of your suggestion, I would ask that our respective staffs come back to us in, I'm going to say, a couple of weeks with an actual timeline with milestones.
That's perfect. I agree.
Yeah.
At least proposed, subject to our respective approvals.
Well, I was giving us some leeway for trying to get calendars all straightened out. So,
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd also just like to point out, it's not a high number, but we do have another municipality in the county, St. Lucie Village, which I represent, and I think that we do need to have a brief conversation with them. Not that it's a large number, but I think that they should be included in some of the conversation. So I would just like to ask if you could have a conversation with them, please.
And we did present to them last year as part of it.
Commissioner Townsend, I will apologize. That was my oversight. They're always included.
I know they are.
Okay.
I just didn't want them to think they were left out.
All right, both you and Mr. Blackburn,
I think we
Feel
are
like you've
clear
got
in our
direction.
direction. Our initial steps will be to come back and give you that proposed timeline. And then we will continue to work with Mr. Van Cor on the polling questions. And again, we'll circle back around and figure out when we can begin meeting with the various associations to start that conversation.
okay. Once again, before we close, I do want to express to the members of the business community that are represented out in the audience, and you know who you are, our doors are open. Come talk to us, or let us come talk to you and tell us some of your feedback. You've heard our discussion today. So,
Madam Chair
yes.
and Mayor, clarification. We haven't really discussed it. I know we're going to come back with the poll about their surtax amount, but from what I understood was said is the question's going to be half a cent versus 1 cent, 10-year versus 20 years. So we could actually come back with an answer of a 0.5% for 20 years.
Right.
I thought in some of the discussions it was going to be a 0.5 cent for 20 years or 1 cent for 10 years. Are they even going to be asking that question?
You mean in the polling that they're
In the
looking
polling.
to? That is my understanding.
And
That
I
was
know
one of the
it's your
options.
ultimate decision being the county, but to me,
No, I would
1
hope we're all
cent.
in it together.
I know, we're a team. Isn't that going to scare a lot of people? What?
I think that's a part. I think that's
That's
a
for
part
you,
of the
Ben.
polling that's going to be.
But I thought, you know, if they do the 0.5 cent versus 1 cent, and then they ask 10 years versus 20 years, in other words, is it 0.5 cent for 20 or 1 cent for 10?
And Mr. Van Cor would answer that question
Okay, 'cause-
scientifically, but we will certainly try to cover the ground so that we know what the public is willing to support.
Okay, and then just one on the ballot language. I always remember KISS. Keep it simple, keep it short, less is more.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
On that note, Mayor, thank you and your council for being here today. I think we've accomplished quite a bit, although it may sound it was confusing to some. I actually felt like we've accomplished more than we thought.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We look forward to
Thank
the
you.
next one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And at this time, the Board of County Commissioners are adjourned.
And